And thank you for the introduction and the chance to present today. I'll be talking about integrated research infrastructure, sort of in a historical sense and in terms of the DOE effort, and then in terms of the Nexus effort at ALCF. So ALCF has a long history of supporting experimental scientific computing, and so we'll talk through that. And then, as I said, some discussion of IRI in general, and then Nexus, which is ALCF's effort in IRI space. If you look at the evolution of systems at ALCF, I won't talk through all of these, but clearly we've been advancing through many upgrades to a larger and larger scale, traditionally supporting modeling and simulation workloads. I think we're all aware of Aurora being the next big system at ALCF. I'd call out just a couple things along the bottom of this timeline, where we instituted the JLSE, a lab for experimenting with new systems, new architectures, the AI testbed in 2020, and an edge testbed in 2021. Some of these things will show up in later slides. So while the ALCF and the computing facilities have been advancing through time and growing through time through upgrades, we can look at the 24 experimental facilities that are operated by the Department of Energy. And they are across a broad range of areas, but in a lot of ways, they've undergone upgrades similar to what the computing facilities have done. And some of them are undergoing them now. And with all of these upgrades, their data rates and their computing needs increase similarly. And some of them will grow beyond the computing that they have locally, and therefore lead us to a place where we're talking about how they could leverage remote computing at the DOE computing facilities. Not included here are, of course, the computing facilities, so ALCF, OLCF, NERSC, ESNet, and HPDF, which is was awarded recently. Just to talk for a minute about the history of experimental scientific computing support at ALCF. If we can go all the way back to an example from high energy physics with the ATLAS project. In 2015 and 16, we supported simulation of events in the detector, the ATLAS detector, with a director's discretionary allocation and through the ALCF data science program, and then through the early science program. And in this case, the project used hundreds of millions of core hours on MIRA. To give you an idea how far back we're going here. MIRA has been out of commission for some time. And in fusion energy sciences, we supported online analysis of fusion data while the tokamak was operating. We'll talk more about that one shortly. Also in high energy physics, we supported through an ADSP project simulation and analysis of telescope images for LSST DESC, now the Rubin Observatory. With HEP and LIGO, we were doing multi-messenger astrophysics, where we're detecting events through LIGO so that we can then have that event propagate to, say, telescopes that can adapt and redirect to look for evidence of the events, the gravitational wave events that occurred or were detected at LIGO. In the picture on the left, this is a picture of a mouse brain reconstructed from images taken at the Advanced Photon Source. This is not, if it makes you queasy, I apologize. It's not a real image, of course. It's colorized to look that way. But similarly here, this is work with BES, and supported through a director's discretionary project, an ADSP, and ESP. Again, in fusion energy sciences, we later had an ESP project that was applying deep learning to the plasma to understand how to tune hyperparameters to predict and mitigate disruption events. This is ongoing. In BES, with the light sources, we've been working with them for years, and we continue to work with them, and that will show up in later slides. With the short baseline neutrino detector, we've been supporting that project with a DD and an ADSP that also still we still work with them on that project. To look specifically at an example from fusion, we worked with them at one point to look at the analysis that we could do while the experiments were taking place in a tokamak. And so the cadence of experiments there is that they have a shot in the tokamak every 20 minutes. And then between shots, they have time to collect the data, analyze the data, and make decisions about how to configure the tokamak for the next experiment. And you can see in the plot on the lower right, which I'll blow up here. Originally, the way that they did this was that they ran an experiment with one configuration, and then they had a time between that run and the next run. So config 2, config 3. And the analysis time when they were doing this locally at GA, at General Atomics, took longer than the time that they had between shots. So we configured this to run in a way that as soon as the data was taken, a job was submitted at ALCF, which included a transfer of the data and analysis of that data on, at the time, the Cooley cluster. And then the results were pushed back into the database at GA. And the upshot of that is that instead of the analysis time taking so long that those results were not available for the next experiment, they were available well in advance of the next experiment. And that means that they were more informed for the next shot, but also because of the greater computing time we had available, we were able to run the analysis at 16 times the resolution that they were using at the time. This is I think a testament to the idea of integrating remote computing in with the experimental facility. And even though in this case the data that was transferred was not large by the estimates that we would usually apply, it's still a testament to the ability to transfer the data over, across the country from San Diego to Chicago, and then run the analysis and push the results back. Around that same time, we started working with light sources around the country. So in this case, APS, of course, at Argonne, but also ALS and NSLS2, at how we could take data during the experiments and transfer it, similar to the fusion case, to theta at the time, run a spectroscopy code, and then push the results back to the corresponding light source. And there's some estimate of the XPCS, which is the application, the workloads that they're anticipating. So you can see they're significant and will continue to grow. In that experiment, we collected a number of data sets from APS for XPCS for spectroscopy. And we chose the largest of them. We had like 100,000 data sets, and we chose the largest of them, which was a 40 gigabyte data set. and we simulated analysis of that data set at ALCF, in this case on theta, transferring that 40 gigabyte data set from each of APS, ALS, and NSLS2 continuously over the course of 48 hours. So the way that the analyses, the experiments run at the light sources is that experimenters will get an allocation of beam time, which is for 2 or 3 days, and they run their experiment continuously through that time. But we wanted to model that same experience. And so we ran for 48 hours. We transferred these data sets continuously over that time and analyzed them. And you can see in the plots that the rate at which we were submitting jobs we completed jobs at a rate that approximated how quickly they were being submitted. And all 3 of these ran simultaneously over the 2 days. In another example, so instead of taking data from 3 light sources and analyzing it at ALCF, we had a different example where we collected data from 2 light sources, in this case, APS and ALS. And we analyzed them at 3 different compute facilities. So ALCF and OLCF and NERSC. And you can see on the bottom, the differences in terms of us keeping up with the jobs as they're submitted in the cases where we're processing data just from APS or just from ALS or a combination of the 2. So we'll talk about IRI for just a minute. So along the same timeline, starting in 2018, 2019, we started having discussions with DOE as they originated this, what would become the IRI project. And it culminated really in this IRI blueprint activity report, which was published last year. I call out just a couple of high-level areas here. So the report identifies science patterns and practice areas. And I hope that any of you from experimental facilities are familiar with the report, are familiar with the effort. The effort was a result of bringing together people from 23 different experimental facilities. 150 people participated in data collection. And so it's very likely that your work, your method of operating is captured in the practice areas and also in the science patterns. So in the science patterns, we distinguish between a few different cases. These are not mutually exclusive, but a time-sensitive pattern where you really need results during your experiment, for example. A data integration intensive pattern where you just have a large amount of data potentially spread across multiple sites. And a long-term campaign pattern where then that data would persist over a long period and would need to be accessible to a community for later analysis. One example that I like to call out here is from a white paper that was published in March of 2021. This detail is included in the blueprint activity report, but it was in this white paper, and we constructed this diagram to basically show that at the time, there are, for each computing facility, there are a number of different aspects. They're all listed on the right side that an experimental facility would need to coordinate access to if they wanted to use NERSC or ALCF or OLCF for their computing. And they would have to do that specially in each case. So that's the diagram that you see at the top. I think even if you're not from an experimental facility, you could identify with this if you've had to run even simulation workloads at multiple different facilities, deal with different accounts, different allocations, different file systems, different schedulers. And the goal was to move to the lower left diagram where integrating once would then allow you to have access to all of the compute facilities. And we wanted to call out specifically that that would simplify the case for one experimental facility, of course, but that is compounded by multiple experimental facilities benefiting from this. That may seem obvious, but if you just imagine the top diagram with 3 experimental facilities, clearly it would be some unmanageable complexity. So this is a slide from Ben Brown at DOE, Oscar, from the ASCAC meeting in June of 2023. I like the compactness of this slide and the way that it calls out not only the large computing facilities and anticipated HPDF, but the fact that it brings together also those things with local campus computing and computing at the experimental facilities, potentially cloud computing. We really need a way of computing across this continuum. And so it means we have a larger problem to solve. Of course, all of these are connected by, well, at least the DOE resources are connected by ESNet, which has been a significant, equal participant in all of this. One thing in particular that I like about this diagram is that while we could talk about taking data from experimental facilities and computing on it at the compute facilities, which looks like, the diagram would look different in that case, where the computing would be in the center and the experimental facilities would be distributed across the country. But in this case, we put researchers in the middle, which is really to call out, I think, that the whole goal here is to support researchers and the work that they're doing, put them at the center of the universe. So I'll talk a little bit about Nexus, which is our effort at ALCF and Argonne to meet the needs of projects in the IRI space and to understand more about what we need to do and what needs to be done generally in terms of IRI. The goals here really align with the IRI vision to simplify access to DOE resources in terms of having accounts and submitting jobs, automating data transfer and workflows, having robust generalizable solutions. So we could meet the needs of special cases, but really we want to have as much reusable infrastructure here as we can. Do things interactively as much as we can and preserve data and make that data available to the project on a long-term basis, and then support publishing and archiving. To support all of these things, in Nexus, we have established a number of different services or capabilities. One of them is the demand queue. On Polaris, we have set up a demand queue and a corresponding preemptible queue. The jobs submitted to the preemptible queue are acknowledged that they could be evicted from the system at any time if a job comes into the demand queue and needs the nodes that the preemptible job is running on. Those jobs that go in the demand queue come from places like the Advanced Photon Source or a different experimental facility. So they have access to that queue for their on-demand needs, and those jobs run as soon as they possibly can. They're currently 56 nodes in that queue. We also instituted the idea of service accounts. So an experiment can have an account that's dedicated to it and can submit jobs on that basis. This is to simplify the case where we would have, say, a user group came to the APS and wanted to run an experiment over a couple of days. Each individual user would have to have an ALCF account, log in, and use that account to do their work. And clearly over 2 days, they're running in shifts. So they would have to shift between users throughout that time. The service account allows us to automate some of those aspects and to get around the requirement that these users have ALCF accounts. Eagle data sharing, our 100 petabyte file system at ALCF is set up with the Globus sharing capability. So users can define collections of data on the file system and share them publicly or share them with designated users. They don't necessarily require an ALCF account. And it's leveraged in a cosmology data sharing portal, which I'll talk about shortly. We're deploying Globus infrastructure. So beyond the traditional Globus transfer, now we're looking at Globus compute and Globus flows, which allow you to bundle together transfer and compute and build up these wide area workflows. We have instituted the ALCF Community Data Cooperative, which is built on top of the Eagle data sharing, but is a chance for users to capture their data, capture metadata, have it accessible in a web application where they can review it, potentially run further analyses. And then beyond that, we're looking at building dedicated web applications. So in some cases, the needs of users are not captured by things like Jupyter, or there are security concerns that way in terms of the accounts that those users have access to. So this is really a way for users to have more custom views to their data as it resides on our system and make it available to their communities. We're currently developing this in the context of our work with the APS and with HEP, Cosmology project that I mentioned. The data catalogs would be resident on the Eagle file system and support community analysis of data that, again, we'll talk about shortly. And also in the spirit of building reusable infrastructure, we'll look at building web components that can be reused across different projects. So to take APS as an example here, I think you know, what we have here is that the APS has tens of beamlines. They all operate essentially independently with beamline scientists dedicated to each one. And users come into the individual beamlines for their beam time and have now an option of using this integrated computing at ALCF. This works on the basis of Globus tools and on service accounts. And in this case, the first box that you see, which is APS-DM, is the data management service running at the APS. And as data arrives in the DM system, it's transferred to ALCF. A job is submitted. That job runs on Polaris using the demand queue. The results appear on the shared file system, Eagle, and then they're made available to APS. This is a very good, I think, overview of a way that many projects could operate. The fact that it's integrated into the DM system means that the users who come to the APS for their experiments don't have direct access to run jobs at ALCF. It is done for them. So it's a simple separation of concerns in terms of those users not needing to have ALCF accounts, but still being able to leverage analysis on Polaris. I call out on the right side that this example really exercises all three of the patterns that we talked about, which were time intensive, data intensive, and long-term, because we capture this data and store it on the file system for later access to, say, reprocessing of experiments after the time of the experiment. I'll go through this complicated diagram just at a very high level. The way that this works, the way that this is set up for the APS is that on the top you have what this would look like if we were using individual user accounts. And so you see that there's a more complicated flow as individual users set up their own endpoints and have to manage the flow of their data over to ALCF and through specific, here it says FuncX endpoints. FuncX is the prior name of Globus flows. But on the bottom, we have essentially a one-time configuration with the service account that's done by the APS administrator and is then made available to users at the beamline transparently. So again, calling out all of the aspects of the Nexus services and capabilities that I mentioned earlier, we're trying to simplify things here in a way that I think is applicable to not just APS, but many other scenarios. And we've been deploying this at many different beamlines. So I tried to characterize here beamlines that have already run in production. So in the bold green cases, we have these beamlines that are already ready and have run in production. Of course, the APS is now down for an upgrade. It should come back later this year. So while they have run in production, they're not running in production currently because the APS is dark. There are a number of other beamlines that are set up to run, but have not yet done so in production. And then there are some others that were ramping up at the time when I made this slide. If I had to guess, I would probably add more beamlines to each of these categories because this work has just continued to spread. I mentioned Globus tools being used for this, and so just as a very, to give you a brief idea of what this looks like, compute is a service where you specify a function that you want to run, and then you can submit jobs against it that run on a compute endpoint. You can associate compute and transfers into flows and use the Globus federated auth to manage distribution of those flows to endpoints. And this is all supported by web applications that you may be familiar with from managing transfers through Globus. But similarly, you can manage flows there. And so you see lower left, a list of flows. And on the right side, you can see the view that you would get if you wanted to watch the progress of an individual flow. These steps proceed from bottom to top. So you see at the very top, flow succeeded. But below that, you see the progression of steps that this went through in terms of running the analysis, making plots, gathering data, publishing data, transferring, and then finally succeeding. So each of your flows is represented in this web interface. So moving to further work that we have done with D3D at the tokamak. I mentioned before that we had integrated experiment time analysis with Cooley. That's a few years ago. Recently, we have been working with them and at this point, simulating similar efforts. But the differences here is now that we're using the modern tools that we're developing in Nexus. And so you see at D3D, we were looking at if the data originates there when a shot is taken, then we can start a Globus flow at that point, which involves the transfer of data to any of the 3 compute facilities and submits a job to the scheduler. You see in this case, the schedulers are all different, but that's Globus is agnostic to the scheduler, basically hides it behind the interface. And then those results are pushed back to D3D. There's a bit of this is a simulated case, so there are aspects of this that will change as we go to a more production flow, and this work continues. But I wanted to call this one out because it is work that's continuing, and it exposes a couple of interesting aspects, right? The ability to run at multiple compute facilities, and the way that we are setting this up, it is that you could specify where the flow should actually run, but also optionally that if that site, if your preferred site is unavailable, then it can conditionally fall back to one of the other sites. Another example comes from Earth Sciences. So with the ESGF2 project, we took what infrastructure that they already have, which is a searchable database for the data that's captured. They have roughly 7.5 petabytes of data. It was originally at Livermore, now has been replicated to ALCF and OLCF. And through their search system, we can, based on some criteria, search for data that resides there, find out which site it resides at, resolve the data at that location to a specific path on a specific file system, and then compute on it. And so in this example, you see on the left side that this is can be driven by a web interface. We've also driven it through a Jupyter notebook to make this query, locate the data, potentially transfer the data, as you can see in these steps that are identified by circles in the flow. So potentially transfer the data, then compute on it, and then transfer the results back to a destination. In this case, we're just querying for data and making a plot. There's no significant analysis, but the idea is to be able to take data from multiple different places and run jobs on it at multiple different places. In this case, we did demonstrate running the plotting part of this, so what would be an analysis, running that at each of JLab and at ALCF and at NERSC and at OLCF. And as we saw before, you see on the top right, the ability to monitor this flow as it proceeds. I mentioned the ALCF Community Data Co-op, also known as ACDC. The idea here is that if you imagine, I think a good way of thinking about this is that if you imagine the use case where you have users who don't necessarily have an ALCF account, but are using this concept of the flow that is integrated into whatever data collection system they have, moving that data to ALCF, computing on it. That data can be published here in ACDC with associated metadata, which would then allow users to come back later and search and find their data. They can integrate user-defined plots into the view of the data. And then also there's simple access to transfer the data sets via Globus. You see of the two projects on the left, one of them is marked private, one of them is marked public. So this is an option for projects in ACDC, whether they want to make their data generally public or share it only with specified users. So we have some notion of controlling access. And then I wanted to mention a project with the cosmology group at Argonne. So we had previously built a portal for sharing data from dark matter simulations. And in this case, there's data from multiple different simulations over time, run on different systems. These do all reside now at ALCF on the Eagle file system. It's about 150 terabytes of data currently. But this is exposing sort of this, this long-term science pattern that was called out in IRI, and the data intensive pattern, given the size of the data. The team has petabytes of data, so this could grow, of course, significantly, given the space, given future growth. But there's currently an HEP-funded project to develop analysis capabilities that correspond with this data. So while the current portal allows you to select data based on metadata and transfer that to your home institution, maybe users who want this data don't have tens of terabytes of local storage to store that data or enough computing power to then analyze it at their home institutions. So the idea here is to integrate analysis, allow them to analyze the data at ALCF. So very similar to the approach through ACDC or the APS approach. This is being built on some of the Nexus capabilities that I mentioned. So the service account, Globus compute, and Eagle sharing will all feature here. The screenshot that you see is only of the data sharing site, but this is an ongoing project that I think corresponds to many of the aspects of IRI. So that covers recent efforts, which I would term IRI or Nexus. One thing that I also wanted to call out was that in the IRI space, we talk about which machines we can use today, and as we build up IRI capabilities, we need some freedom in terms of where they run, what tools they use, whether those things are ready for production. And so there's a notion of testbed systems. And at ALCF, the testbed system is a small system called Edith. This is previously the testbed system that appeared on the first slide, which we used with the APS, even going back years to do initial work with them on experiment time analysis. It looks just like Polaris. It's just that there are just 4 machines instead of 500. All the ALCF file systems are currently mounted on these systems, so it's a good place for us to run experiments, but also have access to all of our file systems. That, of course, constrains what we can do in terms of a test bed. You know, the notion of a test bed is that you could install various things to try them and then burn the whole thing down and rebuild it. And in the context of more experimental software, maybe you'd be pushing boundaries where you don't want access to the production file systems. It also gives us a different experimental dimension. In terms of networking, you can make outbound connections from the compute nodes. So, and we will extend that so that it's different in that way from Polaris, where you currently can't make outbound connections from compute nodes. In terms of scheduling, it uses PBS Pro, which is consistent with our other systems. And we can run Globus compute workloads on this today. And we're looking at using this for a variety of the other efforts that I mentioned. In the future, Polaris will become a resource for IRI. In some sense, you could say today in the on-demand queue, we're already using part of Polaris this way. But we expect to make more use of Polaris in the future for IRI related work. So in conclusion, I would say ALCF is looking to understand more experimental and observational science areas, and to work with you to see if the work that we're doing in Nexus meets your needs, or if it doesn't meet your needs. Clearly through the blueprint activity, we gathered a lot of detail about the different ways that different experimental science communities operate and the tools that they rely on. A lot of it is captured there, but there's no substitute for working directly with people, getting on the systems and trying to exercise these capabilities. And so if you're, we'd be happy to work with you to see what we can do to extend that at ALCF. And this is all, of course, in the context of the DOE IRI effort, where we are actively looking at what the future infrastructure should look like, and have this effort across all of the compute facilities and all the experimental facilities. And as I said, we captured many of these details in the blueprint activity, but we're still interested in talking with you there and understanding your cases better in that broader context also. I described a lot of different things, and I really wanted to have a slide that explicitly named everybody who's been involved in the ALCF activities and the IRI activities, but I don't think that's possible. So I just called out people who have contributed to IRI over time at all the compute facilities, and the many people who participated in a blueprint activity, and the many people at ALCF who have contributed, many people at multiple different institutions who have contributed to the ALCF efforts.